When I did my unboxing video of the brand new Kamado Joe Kettle Joe, I asked, what do you want to see me smoke first? And the results came in with an overwhelming majority of you wanting to see a brisket. So that's exactly what we're going to do today. A low and slow overnight brisket on the brand new Kamado Joe Kettle Joe. Hey, I'm James from Smokin' Dad Barbecue, and today we're going to be doing a low and slow overnight Texas style brisket on the Kamado Joe Kettle Joe. And the one I picked out, she's not small. It's nearly 23 pounds. And so normally when I do these videos, it's through a whole bunch of experience and trial and error. And I only like changing one thing at a time until we find the perfect method. But today, you're riding along for the maiden voyage, the first ever low and slow cook. In fact, this will be my first cook on the Kamado Joe Kettle Joe. And so I thought it would be helpful to share with you my game plan. How am I gonna tackle a brand new cooker that is actually not a Kamado versus my Kamado Joe Classic or Big Joe. It's not a ceramic style cooker, but it does have the SloRoller. So I'm going to spend our first chapter walking through our game plan. What am I going to try and do? What do I think will happen? And then at the end, we'll compare it to what actually happened. Good, bad, the ugly, doesn't matter. I'm going to share it all with you. Then in our second chapter, I'm going to show you the brisket itself, how we're going to trim and prepare it for tonight's overnight smoke session. And then lastly, it'll be the cook itself as well as the results. So if you're in a bit of a rush, I'll put some timestamps in the description below so you can jump to any of those sections. But I will be sharing kind of my thoughts on the approach all the way through. So definitely recommend it. If you have a couple minutes, hang with me. This is going to be fun. Okay, so game plan for tonight's cook. That's right. We're gonna start this cook just around midnight tonight, but I wanna take advantage of the daylight to just come up with my game plan. And as a side benefit, Mother Nature does a much better job of lighting up our barbecue, myself, so that you can actually see what's going on versus me fumbling around in the dark in the middle of the night. So we have to check our assumptions on a couple of things. So first of all, I never use a water pan in any of my Kamados. But this is not a Kamado. This is steel walled versus ceramic. So it's not going to retain the same amount of moisture that the Kamado Joe Classic or the Big Joe would retain. So we have to make a decision here. Do we stick with no water pan or add a water pan? So I want to check and see how that fits. The next thing we need to check is charcoal quantity. How much are we going to be able to fit in here? Smoking wood placement. Now, one of the advantages of an actual Kamado style cooker is they're incredibly fuel efficient. But one of the disadvantages of a Kamado style cooker is they're incredibly fuel efficient. And so that makes maintaining really low and slow temperatures very difficult because you barely have any coals burning and it's hard to get clean combustion and get a smoke ring. I've noticed I get much better smoke rings when I do a brisket at 270 degrees, so 250 to 270 degrees, versus if I try and hold, 200 to 225 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's just because we're not getting the advantage of the chemical reaction that goes on with clean burning charcoal as well as clean burning smoke wood. And so I actually think there might be a small advantage here with the Kettle Joe in the sense that it's not as efficient. So it's going to be burning a lot more aggressively. And so that might help us out with our smoke ring. Fingers crossed, but it also means we're not getting as good a fuel mileage. And so this might mean some challenges in terms of being able to hold our heat all night. Now, what Kamado Joe has done with the Kettle Joe is they've gone ahead and added some ceramic plates into a firebox, and that is supposed to help retain some heat. So I'm hoping we get the best of both worlds, a little bit of heat retention from those ceramic plates, as well as a slightly less efficient fire in terms of getting a great smoke ring. All good in theory, we'll find out in practice. You can go ahead and ridicule me one way or the other, depending if this is a brisket win or a brisket fail. Speaking of fail, you can't even say the word fail. I'm just allergic to it, I guess. Okay, so the next assumptions have to do with the brisket itself, as well as our vent settings. And so on the brisket itself, we have to make a decision here. Fat cap up, fat cap down? There's a lot of different theories and information on this, and it's usually really good information, but it's also very specific to the type of cooker that you're using. Now, I've really landed on my method for the Kamado Joe, where I've really been able to zoom in on the 3 types of heat that it has. We have our convection heat, which is hot air moving. We have our conduction heat, which is cold meat touching a hot surface. And then we also have this radiant heat that we're getting from our ceramic. I'm not really sure how this is going to play out in the Kamado Joe Kettle Joe. We're not having the same degree of radiant heat because the walls of our dome are not ceramic. And we might have more convection heat, hot air moving throughout the grill because of that hotter, cleaner burning fire. And so while you might be tempted to put the fat cap down towards the heat source, here there's actually a sizable gap between our firebox and the bottom of the meat, but much smaller gap with the smaller dome in terms of how it's going to sit, I think, with the brisket on. So I'm going to go ahead and say for today's cook, we're rolling the dice. We're going to go fat cap up based off of having enough distance, I think, and I'll show you in a second, from the bottom of our brisket to where our fire will be, as well if we decide to use that water pan or not. And I think that will help in terms of providing some protection from the dome, which will still get heat soaked as metal and be radiating some of that heat. So that's our big bet assumption for our brisket. Let me bring the camera a little bit closer. I'll start to show you some of those assumptions in practice in terms of what it'll look like inside of our Kettle Joe. And the second thing that I mentioned, and the last portion of this chapter, is our vent settings. And so I did a bit of a break-in burn when I first assembled it, but I didn't get a chance to really play with our vent settings. If I was going for 250 degrees, I'd be looking for, on our Big Joe here, just inside this first line. So I don't know if that carryover measurement is going to work or not with our Kettle Joe, which also has a control tower top with 1, 2, 3, 4 lines, but again, a different amount of air. So let me bring the camera a little closer and we'll get started showing you what this setup could look like inside. Okay, so here's what I'm thinking for our setup. And I was looking at the amount of space between where our charcoal will be. Right now the SloRoller's not in, if that is a good spot for a drip tray. So I went ahead and grabbed the cooking grates off of my Kamado Joe Classic, and they just so happen to fit nicely on the firebox of our Kamado Joe Kettle Joe. I was actually hoping that maybe if I was lucky, the X accessory ring rack for the Kamado Joe Big Joe or the Classic would fit, but they don't fit. So if we're gonna be able to get away with this setup, it's gonna have to be the cooking grids. And what I will confirm next is, can we get enough charcoal in underneath of these? Or will that potentially be hitting? Because that'll go ahead and kill this idea. But right now, really at quick glance, it looks like that gives me space to go ahead and drop on a pan that I could fill up with water. Then install my SloRoller base, the SloRoller itself. And then the next thing I wanted to check is if I could get a drip tray on the SloRoller to protect it from getting the fat drippings. The only one that I have is from Smokeware. I have 2 different sizes, but it looks a little bit too tall, where if I go ahead and I drop these cooking grids on, they are sitting on the grid and not on the base. So they're about 1.5 inches or so too tall. Let me just maybe reposition the camera right there so you can see that it's not touching. And why I think that matters, put the camera back. And so why I think that won't work is if I look at the amount of distance from where this is, the thickness of the brisket, to the dome and the end of our thermometer probe, I think we're gonna get really close to be having this probe touch the brisket or the dome itself touch the brisket. So we can go ahead and rule out our first question mark, which is, are we gonna use a drip tray? And I don't think today we will. Put that back. So instead, when I drop in my cooking grids, I now get that extra couple inches of clearance. So I think this is exactly what we're going to have to do to be mindful of the clearance gap between our cooking grate and our dome. Don't know if there's a better way that I can show that with the camera angle, but the dome is going to be sitting very, very close to the top of our brisket, which is why I think fat cap up is the right decision for today's cook. Okay, so the one thing I know I'm not going to change for this cook on the Kettle Joe versus any of my other Kamado Joes is smoking wood placement. So I'm gonna go ahead and place my smoking wood right on the bottom grate like I always do, because that, again, tends to help the smoke wood last longer. Now, in a Kamado Joe, I normally like the smoke wood down low because we're not getting good clean combustion, and the smoke wood passing, or the smoke passing through the burning coals, helps get it to that sweet spot temperature, sort of above 500 degrees Fahrenheit, where we get the perfect chemical reaction. But in the Kamado Joe Kettle Joe, where I think the charcoal is going to be burning a little bit more aggressively, I actually want to try and preserve this and protect it. If I was to build up the charcoal fire and put this on top, I think it would just burn up right away, as well as make our temperatures a little bit more difficult to control. So today is more about smoke wood preservation. The other thing I'll point out here is smoke wood quantity. And so I like to stick to 95%, 90% charcoal to 5 to 10% smoking wood. And that's, again, where I get the best results. But looking at the size of the firebox, especially if we do end up using that the grids and a water pan, there's not a lot more space here for charcoal, and so I think the most I can get away with and stick with that ratio that's worked so well for me is going to be about 2 pieces of oak smoking wood. So let's go ahead now and add some big block. Okay, so come out a fast forward for this. So one of the things I normally am a big believer in is don't ever add this much charcoal, because it's more than we need. But for an overnight low and slow cook, maiden voyage on a Texas style brisket on the Kamado Joe Kettle Joe, I'm not sure how much of this charcoal we're going to use. So I think I'm going to err on the side of a little bit more, even though I may come to regret that. Let's go ahead and test fit our grids. I think this might still be a bit too much for the grids to sit down. I just want to give a sense of which pieces are protruding that I might need to remove. Okay, so first change of plan. As you may see here, as I drop down the grids, I'm not happy about a couple things. One, I think if I remove enough coal to get this to sit flat, there might not be enough coal for a long, low, slow brisket cook. The other thing I'm not really excited about is having my nice alloy grids from my Kamado Joe Classic 3 sitting essentially in the fire. So I went again and I was checking, you know, the ceramic plates from the Classic don't fit. Big Joe don't fit. Well, barely fit. You can kind of barely prop it up there, but it's a little precarious. But I did find maybe an alternative solution, which is the grid expander from the Kamado Joe Big 3 is not only the right size, but these little legs sit nicely on the firebox ring all the way around. It's supported. Plus it sits up away from the fire, so it's not just getting blasted the entire time by flames. And I think rebuilding our setup here, it gives a spot for our drip pan with water, or correct that, water pan, as well as letting the base of our SloRoller extender, SloRoller, and cooking grids fit nicely. So if I just remove these, you can see there's still several inches of clearance for this water pan below the SloRoller. And so looking at all the options, I think I like this the most. It's going to raise this water pan up and away from the fire, but it's still going to help evaporate this water and get us some nice moisture. So that evaporation will be at about 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 degrees Celsius. Then that water, steam, along with our smoke below, is going to hit our SloRoller and then come out and be dispersed throughout our dome and come and hit our brisket. So right now, I am excited by how all that's coming together. So I'm going to go ahead and call that our game plan. We'll lock it in and get ready to fire it up a little bit later on. Let's start prepping our brisket. Okay, so we are ready to trim our brisket, and as you can see, this one is large and in charge, coming in at just under 23 pounds. And so what the game plan is here, we're going to go ahead and trim it up and then hit it with our seasoning. So for seasoning, I just mix salt and pepper 50-50 and then add a little bit of garlic and just mix that up, and that'll be our seasoning. So let me just show you really quick how I like to trim my briskets, and I'll take you fast forward while I get to work, as this is gonna take me a little while. So the first thing I like to do is just go ahead and reduce our fat cap down on the flat to about 1/4 of an inch. The next thing I wanna do is go ahead, this side's not too bad, but where anywhere we have any sort of gray looking meat from the processing factory, just gonna go ahead and clean that up so we have sort of some nice square edges. And this soft fat, I'm not too worried, but this hard packed fat, this isn't going to render out. And so I'm going to remove a fair bit of this hard fat that won't render during our cook. On our meat side here, things don't look too bad. Got a little bit of silver skin that we'll have to work on. And then as well, where you can see our two muscles coming together, a little bit more of that gray stuff from the meat processing factory, as well as some more hard fat here in towards the decal. So I'm gonna go ahead, take you fast forward while I trim this up, and then I'll rejoin you when it's time to season it. Okay, so as you can see, we had quite a lot of trimming to do. So we definitely lost maybe a couple bucks worth of meat just off the end, squaring this up, and off the sides. But most of this stuff is just hard white fat, not stuff that we're going to want to eat. And so now we've got about, you can see here, 1/4 inch along our flat for our fat cap. Not as much on the point, but that's fine. There's lots of intermuscular fat. And then cleaned up our decal here, so we're not sitting on a whole bunch of hard intermuscular fat, again, between our point and our flat on the bottom where they meet, as well on the other side, separating those two muscles. I can't get too much more aggressive along here, as I'll start to cut into the point end. So I think that's about as far as I can go on this particular brisket, even though I'd love to hollow out the side a little bit more. So now we're gonna go ahead and just season this up. So I'm going to season the bottom. Today the meat side's going to be our bottom, and then our presentation side, our fat cap last, because that's where we're really going to focus on trying to get our bark and have that fat render out into a nice, delicious crust. So back to fast forward while we season this up. Okay, our brisket is rubbed up and ready to go. So I'm just going to let this hang out, and we'll get ready to fire up our Kamado Joe Kettle Joe. All right, the nighttime is the right time. So quick update, looking at the size of that brisket, I think I may want to start it a touch earlier than midnight, so it's just after 10 o'clock local time. So here's the game plan. Since the Kettle Joe is brand new to us and we want to find out if our vent setting assumptions, which I'll show you in a second, are spot on or not, I want to go ahead and start my fire, bring the Joe up to temperature, and get it stable before adding my water pan. And so while that water pan is going to help add nice humid air, as the water evaporates at 100 degrees Celsius, 200 degrees, 12 degrees Fahrenheit, I don't want that to potentially throw me for a loop in terms of, is it actually cooler and do I need more air, etc., and then have big temperature spikes in the nighttime. So to help manage that, I'm going to go ahead, lock it in at temperature right now so that I know the vent settings are good for 250 degrees, regardless if I'm getting maybe a different reading or a much lower reading on the thermometer probe on our Kettle Joe. So let me bring the camera nice and close, we'll fire it up, wait till we're stable, and our vent settings are good, and once they're good, and that's giving us nice clean smoke, we go ahead and throw on our nice big Texas brisket on the Kamado Joe Kettle Joe. Okay, so as you can see, I've got everything out for the time being. We'll go ahead and add all our gear later. Let's go ahead and light it up. Now, normally on my Kamado Joes, I like to light the fire front and center because there's a natural draw towards the back. I'm not sure if that's going to be the same in a kettle style barbecue. So I'm gonna go ahead and light pretty much in the center, or as close to center as possible, And tomorrow, when it's all cool, we'll look at our charcoal and see if we can make better sense of which burn direction is actually going on inside the Kettle Joe. Let's fire it up. Okay, that looks good. So let's go ahead and just drop the base of our SloRoller in. We'll have to remove this again to put everything back, but just so again I can get a sense of how the temperature is going to respond to this in it. I want to get as much information as I can before we settle for the night and trust our big brisket alone on the Kettle Joe. Okay, so in the amount of time that I could go inside and make ourselves a little foil drip pan, since we can't fit our smokeware inside, our Kamado Joe Kettle Joe has shot up just over 300 degrees Fahrenheit. So I've already adjusted the vents back down to what I suspected we would need ahead of time, which is 1 finger on the bottom and about the 50% mark on the first line, and we are holding about 300 degrees. So rather than trying to like really pinch it down and then figure it out, what I want to do now is just go ahead and get the rest of our gear in and then make any adjustments over the next hour or so before calling it a night, going to bed, to make sure I know it's going to be stable for the rest of our cook. I've also added some hot water to our water pan, and that's going to do a couple things. One, it'll just help bring up the temperature a little bit more quickly so that doesn't throw us for a loop. And as that water evaporates, it'll turn into steam, which will help those smoke particles attach and adhere to our brisket. The other benefit of the water is it also is sort of a stabilizing force, and it'll have some radiant heat itself, and it'll help neutralize any of those swings up or down as our fire, as I learn how to control our fire better in the Kettle Joe. So hoping it'll help neutralize everything. So anyways, let's come a little bit closer. Now we got our first key learning in the books. This thing heats up much quicker than I'm used to. All right, let's go ahead. First of all, remove our SloRoller base. And this is where a not being used Big Joe is really handy, as it fits right inside. Drop in our Big Joe Kamado Joe grid extender rack. This is what's going to hold our water pan. Looks good. Let's go ahead and add our water pan. Roller base back on. Okay. Looks like we're not exceeding the diameter of the SloRoller top piece. So let's go ahead and install our grids of our brisket. So I'm just taking advantage of it while I can, trying to shrink it into space. Let's go ahead and see if that will close. All right, so it's just about 10:45 p.m. local time. So now that we got our brisket on, I'm also going to take the opportunity to get some data. I suspect some things are going to go wildly different than I expect in practice versus theory. To help me do that, I'm going to go ahead and throw in a meter probe to help me this evening in terms of just keeping track of my vent settings so I can go to bed and actually sleep rather than thinking all night wondering how the brisket cook is going. But also tomorrow, when this is all said and done, it'll give me some data that I can go back and look at things that happened while we were off and asleep and help make sense if something goes right or if something goes wrong. It'll just help me validate my assumptions going into my cook next time. So if you haven't heard this before, I'm a big fan of data, especially when learning a new cooker. Hey, good morning. We are now 11 hours into our brisket cook. So let me catch you up on everything that's happened since I left you last time. So before going to bed, I let the cook go for about 2 hours, and I'm so glad we did our strategy of getting up to temperature before adding the water pan. So if you remember, we overshot our temperature of 250 degrees a little bit, and we ended up close to 300 before settling it back down in about the 270 range. When we added our water pan, got our brisket on, almost immediately the temperature dropped and was holding around that 210 or so degrees Fahrenheit, which is exactly what we would expect to happen when we're boiling water and the steam is, only coming off the water pan at about 212 degrees Fahrenheit, which is kind of cooling the air. And so I let that go for about 2 hours, and I wanted to see how we were doing before going to bed because I could hear the water boiling. So about 2 hours into our cook, I went ahead, pulled everything out, and I had some extra water just to make sure we weren't too low, and we were down about a third. And given this is now, around 1 in the morning, I went ahead and just topped up the water. The other thing that I was noticing is pretty big spreads in our 2-meter probes, but I installed them one sideways, one vertically. And so I went ahead and just adjusted those so that they were more similar. We are now reading within 6 degrees on the 2 probes, front and back. And I'm not really concerned about that slight difference because one is in the point and it's up high and one is in the flat, it's down low. I think that's completely normal to get, a 5-6 degree Fahrenheit range. So that was it. Put everything back on the Kamado Joe Kettle Joe and let it run all night, which brings us to our next update, which is about 9 hours of burn time later. So at about the 9-hour mark, first thing this morning, I wanted to go ahead and take a look and see how we were doing on our charcoal, especially as I started to see those temperatures drop. So what happened when our water was boiling overnight, we were holding about that 230 degrees. Once the water expired, the temp spiked to about 270, which is exactly where it was when we left off before installing our water pans, so no surprise. But around 5:30 this morning, you can see in our meter chart, the temperature started dropping back towards 230 degrees. And so we've either got an airflow restriction or we're running out of fuel. So I went ahead and started to open up our Kettle Joe to see what's going on. And as soon as I set aside our brisket, which is looking pretty darn good, by the way, I could see that we are getting low on our fuel source. So while this maybe we could have overfilled the basket a little bit more, or maybe I could have just left this and opened up the air, we might have been able to stretch it to 10 hours. I think that gave us our first answer, which is the more efficient burning fire is less efficient in terms of fuel mileage. And so this is going to cap out on a fuel load somewhere between 9 to 10 hours. Now it's just below freezing here where I am tonight. So for a non-insulated, non-Kamado Kettle Joe, that's pretty great. So I definitely think that's a bit more efficiency than I ever remember getting on a kettle grill. But it's not like the Big Joe, which on a single load of charcoal I've ran for 56 hours at the same temperature. While I had everything out, I went ahead and dropped in 2 more pieces of smoke wood, added a little bit more charcoal on top just to help get us through the next 8 hours or so of cooking time. And I normally don't like to add charcoal and then just add our food back because you might get some of that non-clean burning smell. So I just hit it for a few seconds with my grill torch, even though there was hot embers underneath, just to accelerate that initial combustion so we're getting nice clean smoke. I've been really happy with the smell and the look of the smoke rolling off the SloRoller, especially with that steam. So we've got all that steam, that smoke, those smoke and water molecules attach themselves right to our paint. It's like a super smoke paintbrush, if you will, or spray paint for our brisket. And so I hit that water pan one more time to get a little bit more smoke, even though at our internal temperature of 156 degrees at the time, we're getting close to the end of our brisket being able to take on any more smoke flavor. And we want to transition to building our presentation bark, which brings us to our next step. The next thing that we're also going to do is we're going to do not a Texas crutch, but a Texas boat. And this is a method that I came across on a friend's page on Instagram, the Smoky Bird, who showed and responded to some questions I had on it. But one of the things that can happen when you have your cooking source directly below your brisket is it's hard to get a great bark on the top. And so by the time you get a great bark on the top, you can be overcooked and brittle or tough to cut through and kind of ruin your slices on the bottom. And so a great way to prevent this is to do the Texas boat. So I'll show you all about the Texas boat in a second, but it's essentially half a wrap where our bottom is going to be protected and collect any of those juices that come out of our brisket as it continues to render. And our top surface, which is our fat cap up, will continue to be able to render out, absorb any smoke, and give us that final presentation Texas style brisket bark that we're looking for. So let me bring the camera nice and close and we'll get to work and check out if we need any more smoking wood, as well as building our Texas boat. Okay, so we're ready to grab our brisket. I've just used some latex gloves over some cotton high heat gloves so we can handle our brisket. I've joined together a couple pieces of foil so that we can try Mike's method here with the Texas boat. And so we'll just end up rolling these around the edge of our brisket. So let's go ahead, open up our Kettle Joe, transfer our brisket, and start rolling the foil. Okay, this Texas boat method looks really good. I hope our results are half as good as what Mike has shared from some of his cooks. But again, the theory is what we're going to do is just help protect the bottom meat side from drying out, which is something that will happen especially as we let this last load of water evaporate and expire. And if we do that, when we go to slice through, it'll just be dry, brittle, and it'll tear. We won't get good slices. The downside here is that we won't be able to retain the bark that we've already built on the bottom, as some of these fats, as they render out, they'll collect in the bottom and keep it soft, but that's okay. We're looking for our presentation side bark on the top, and if we were going to crutch it anyways, no matter what we do, it would get a little bit of soggy with foil. So I'm hoping that this method actually does provide the best of both worlds. Saves our bottom, allows us to build an even more amazing bark on the top, so we get some incredibly tender Texas style brisket slices when this is all said and done. Let's get this back to bed. All right, we have been stuck at about the 186 to 189 on both our meter probes for a little while, and I'm no longer confident we're gonna make it until dinner. And so what the game plan is now is go ahead and cover the rest of our brisket up just to speed it up. I know that the Texas crutch, when we wrap a brisket, I can normally gain about 20 degrees on the high side Fahrenheit per hour. And so what I want to do is just help accelerate that till we can get to our final temperature so we can go ahead and rest. At this point, the rest is more important than finishing dry with no cover on top of our brisket, because that'll just really help it reabsorb some of the moisture that it's been pushing out and increase the overall taste and juiciness of our brisket. So to do that, I just went ahead and transferred our brisket into a large foil pan, covered it tightly, wrapped it up with some tin foil, and put it back on our Kamado Joe Kettle Joe with the temperature dial exactly where we left it for another hour or so. I think should get us to our final temperature. See you in a bit. All right, just 15 minutes shy of 17 hours later, I think our brisket is done. Let me bring the camera close and show you what I'm looking for in probe feel. But if you had to imagine what it should feel like, you want to take your Thermapen and pretend you were putting into a stick of room temperature butter. And that's exactly what we're getting right now on our flat as well as our point. So the game plan here is I'm just going to put the foil back on after I show you that probe feel test. We're going to wrap it in a towel and put it in a cooler, which you can't quite see, but is off camera, and I'll take you fast forward for all that. We're going to let this rest for a minimum of 2 hours before slicing into it, find out how we did. All right, let's check this out. Get rid of this foil so you can see. And this is one good looking brisket. Let's go ahead and do the probe test here. Try and hold it in a way so you can see, but that, if I just let go, whew, it's falling right through the brisket. So we're about 204, 206 there. Come up to the point. 203, 204. I think this is done. There is zero resistance in our flat, zero resistance in our point. The bark looks incredible. So let's go ahead. We'll wrap this back with foil tightly around the edge. I'll put a towel around that and then drop the whole thing in our cooler. All right, after 17 hours on the grill, 2 hours in foil, our overnight low and slow Texas style brisket on the Kamado Joe Kettle Joe is done. Time to slice into it and find out how it looks, and more importantly, how it tastes. Let's go for some super slow-mo or close-up slicing action and look together how we did. Okay, so those look phenomenal. Now, this is cooling off quick, so I'm going to jump into our taste test so we can still get a sense of our texture and juiciness. But that smoke ring is amazing. So we've got a flat piece here as well as some point. Let's go ahead. Oh, it's just going to fall apart. Barely holding together. Technically holding together, but barely. It is tender. So let's go ahead, just pull a piece here, give you a sense of just fall apart without any effort. Let's go ahead, get a nice bite of our flat. We'll do a complete recap at the end because there's too much to cover before my point cools off. That is amazing. I always like to judge a brisket by the flat, and if that's how the flat is, so tender, so juicy, smoke is on point, the bark on the top, the bark on the bottom, we didn't get any of that hard to cut through stuff. It is perfect. Let's go ahead and try our point end. Again, it's just really, really tender, flopsy mopsy. This is our point end, great smoke ring, and I think with the slightest tug, just comes right apart. Woo-hoo. I'm gonna clean up, take that inside so it doesn't cool off too much for dinner. Be right back and we'll do a complete recap. Okay, so recap time. So this is hands down one of the best briskets I've ever done. It was also one of the most involved briskets I've ever done. Managing our fire, we got about 9 hours of burn time, so we're adding charcoal, adding some smoke wood. We went through, I think, about 5 loads of our water pan, so keeping up, managing that, and holding our temperatures within a plus or minus 10 to 15 degrees up and down of our target 250 degrees was an active cook, but boy, oh boy, did it all come together at the end with an amazing taste test. Now, to be fair, I've been doing a lot of briskets lately, and the repetitions really help. So that foil boat came out of one of my last cooks where it was an amazing brisket, but the bottom bark was just a little bit overdone that really held it back. And so that's one of the things, regardless of what grill you're using, repetitions go a long way. The other thing that really helped is just coming up with that game plan, taking our experience in terms of our vent settings. I am so glad that we set our vent settings, got a temperature before we added our water pan, because if I hadn't done that and I was seeing 200 degrees on the Kettle Joe's thermometer or the meter, which for a period when we were steaming that water, they were both reading around 206 degrees. I would have overcorrected, adjusted my vents, gone to bed, and I'm sure when I woke up, I would have seen my meter probe chart spiking up into the high 3s, if not 400 degree range. So just trusting our vent settings would eventually show the accurate number once all of that water evaporated and we got it back to our true sort of temperature range. And then, you know, the last thing that I think I can really highlight here is just, again, you know, sticking to as few of variables as possible, even though this time we threw a few extra in there, including our Texas boat instead of our Texas crutch. But otherwise, the temperature that we know is working really well for us on our Kamado Joe. The time, that 17, 18 hours is where I often land. Our trim, our seasoning, everything else, we tried to reduce as many variables so that we are building off of a good foundation. And that's definitely some advice that I'd give to you. Well, anyways, I hope you really enjoyed today's cook. I saw in the comments of my Kamado Joe Kettle Joe unboxing, brisket was #1, but we were in a tie for #2 between pork shoulder, ribs, and some steak. So let me know in the comments down below which one you'd like to see next, and I'll go ahead and get to work on sharing that cook with you soon. Make sure you're subscribed with the notification bell on so you're alerted when it comes out. But until then, this is James from Smokin' Dad Barbecue signing off. And remember, don't be afraid to fire it up. Do you like brisket? Say, good girl. How'd we do? Do you like it? Do you like it? Do you want some more? Yeah, well, that looks good.